I invite you to join me in a reflection on Jesus' parable of the two houses. This appears at the end of chapter 7 in the Gospel of Matthew, at the end of Jesus' inaugural teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. And this passage is what you might call a closing argument, Jesus' closing argument for God's logic in the reign of God, the land of the right side up. So before we get into that reading, I'd like to share with you the image that we're offered today as we talk about building on a solid foundation, building on solid ground. This is an image of mother and child painted by the artist Juliet Pita, who is from the island nation of Vanuatu, which is a cluster of islands, a nation in the Pacific, the South Pacific Ocean, to the east of Australia. And it's a very tender image, but if you look closely, you'll notice this massive blue wave coming and clawing its way across the land. It recalls the cyclone of 2015, which completely devastated this island nation and made the leaders of that nation realize that they needed to come up with a disaster plan that could match the magnitude of the storms that it was now incurring. So again, a very good reminder to build on solid ground, solid foundation. So let's ready ourselves to receive the Word of God from Matthew chapter 7. Jesus said to his disciples and to the crowds, "Everyone who hears my words and puts them into practice is like the wise one who built her house on rock. The rains fell, the floods came, the winds blew and buffeted the house, but it did not collapse. It had been built solidly on rock. Everyone who hears my words but does not put them into practice is like the foolish one who built her house on the shifting sands. The rains fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and lashed against the house. It collapsed and was completely ruined." When Jesus finished this discourse, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not like their scribes. Building on solid rock, building on shifting sands. We choose one or the other. So Jesus says a few things in this parable. He says, "Everyone who hears my words." And I'm thinking here of two different kinds of ear. The outer ear that we hear with, but the inner ear, what I call the ear of the heart. And the heart is so important. Heart, mind, spirit, interior self, which is the place from which we do our living. So what the interior ear hears is very important. And it matters what we pay attention to. Jesus seems to be saying, find that foundation that is solid enough to support the weight of your being in this world. Strong enough to support your commitments, your responsibilities, your ways of showing up. So we discover what we're made of when the storms actually come in. I'm indebted to the Oregon Historical Society for this image. It's a collapsed structure, and it's an after effect of the Columbus Day storm of 1962. If you were in Oregon at that time, then you remember this storm. It was that big. much devastation, some loss of life, but incredible property devastation, buildings completely demolished, trees collapsed. It was a massive storm. It was actually a cyclone, which we don't get in the West Coast. But it was a cyclone that we were unprepared for because it was not typical of our weather. So we might have different kinds of storms in our lives. We might have ice storms and wind storms. We might have snowstorms. We might have firestorms, as we did last summer. We might have a different kind of storm, which might be pandemic, and all the devastation and loss from a pandemic, losing loved ones, losing employment, experiencing a shattered economy, losing hope, losing social touch. And then there's the other kind of storm, which I will describe as the moral or social or political storms that can grip the world, that can grip a nation, that can grip a community, or even a family. So we have storms in our lives. The question is, do we get lost in the noise and the chaos, or do we in fact have a solid foundation? So Jesus is speaking of two houses, the physical house and the interior house. He was known as a carpenter, and so I'm sure he had a hand in building some very solid dwelling places for people. But the interior house is the place from which we touch the world. It's our place of viewpoint, our place of judgment, our place of attitude, and even our place of opinion, and what I call opinionating. Even Jesus had an attitude. We oftentimes don't think of that. It's not overtly mentioned in the Gospels, but it is mentioned in the writings of Paul. In his letter to the Philippians in chapter 2 at verse 5, the Apostle Paul says, "Your attitude must be Christ's." Oh, my attitude? He had an attitude. What is that attitude? And Paul goes on to describe what is probably a hymn of the early church, a creedal hymn of the early church. And it begins, "Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God as something to be grasped at." He didn't have the attitude of the favored son. Rather, he took human form, being like a slave. Paul says, your attitude must be Christ's. Not pompous, not built up, but an attitude of service and humility. So we have much to learn there. So imagine having this attitude of Christ, living with a depolarized heart. We've just come through a year-long political campaign season. We've gone through national elections, lots of opportunity for polarization. But if we have the attitude of Christ, we will live with a depolarized heart. Imagine living with a politically unlabeled attitude. Politically delabeled attitude. Not belonging to one camp or another, or taking pride in being on this side or that side, but actually offering the world a fresh lens through which to see the issues that we deal with today. Giving them the opportunity to see through the lens of the reign of God. The image I offer here is a photo. It's something kind of startling I came across in my walks. It's these 3 steps leading up to really nothing but rubble. There's not even a suggestion of a foundation, but we have to guess that there was a house there at some point, or a building or structure of some point, but there's nothing there. Jesus says, no. Live your life and build your house on that solid foundation. So I write in a piece titled, I Believe Jesus. I write these words. Taking Jesus at his word is not complicated unless I make it complicated with all the reasons why I can't, why it's impractical, why it's not the right time, or just too risky. It's easy to think that way when I read the words of the gospel and I think, oh, certainly you can't be meaning those words for me, or I'm just not ready to get out of the boat yet. Let me think about it, or let me find the calm storm, the calm surface, or let me wait until the boat comes to shore, then I'll get out of the boat. That's not what Jesus is saying. It's so easy to come up with reasons why we can't. So I have learned that if I want to follow Jesus, I have to go where he goes and love whom and what he loves. This photo is from near the back of the bus. I was on the number 24 Donald bus, and it occurred to me on this day that these people on this bus were all my people. This is my community. These are the people whose lives I'm given to touch and whose lives touch my life. So if I want to go where Jesus goes, I have to be in the midst of my town, in the midst of my peeps. And my work, because it's the work of Jesus also, is to commit myself to building the reign of God, here and now. So Jesus wants us not only to be prudent about this solid foundation and building our house on it, but he also wants us to be free to build that house, free to build the reign of God in our time. So we can ask, why does any of this matter? Can't I just be a good Christian person and get on with my life and keep a low profile and just kind of be okay? Why does Jesus' teaching matter? And especially this parable of the two houses. Why does it matter today? It matters because we are a Christian community. It's how we identify ourselves. Christian community is meant to be a witness to the world, to be a light to the world. In one place in the Gospels, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And I think, thank God. And then in another place in the Gospels, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. And I think, no, you be the light of the world. And he says, no, you now be the light of the world. So our work as Christian community is to be that witness of light. To be the witness not to power over, but to be the witness to communion with. Not a Christian community that lords power over anyone, but a Christian community that says, let's be in communion together. Maybe including our differences, but communion with is the beautiful thing, the beautiful gift. I rue the day when Constantine, back in the 4th century, converted to Christianity. It was a very smart political move, because now he could enfold the early church into the Roman Empire, give them safety from persecution, legitimize them, tame their message. And we have been living with those constraints ever since, believing that we can be part of the empire and still call ourselves Christian. It doesn't work. Communion with is the only way we can know and witness. So I'd like to offer you 3 questions. The first question is this: upon what foundation do I build my interior house? What news sources shape my opinion? What relationships shape my attitude? What material possessions, or lack of material possessions, shape my way of being in the world? The second question: how might Jesus be inviting me to reconsider the foundations I have chosen? And question 3: what for me is the next step, the difficult step toward a better foundation, a more solid house? These are not easy questions, but we know the magnitude of the invitation by the intensity of the pushback. Oh, I'm not ready to deal with these questions yet, you might say, or just maybe when I get it all together, or sometime when I really understand the gospel and what it's all about. No, these questions are offered in real time, and they are lived out in real time. So we know the magnitude of the invitation by the intensity of the pushback. We have a house to build, each of us and all of us together. The times that we are in demand our action. And thankfully, the words of the teacher form our solid foundation. God bless you.